Claire, welcome to the Beat Your Anxiety Summit. And I'm really excited to have you here to talk to this audience, for these 21 to 30 days, because, this audience really are people who struggle to get their needs met. They feel like they're not heard, they're not seen in their relationships. They're called codependents. A lot of them are recovering people pleasers and really struggle to really feel good about themselves or feel safe and secure. And I'm really excited and happy to have you here to talk about, what grief has to do with anxiety, because I feel like this topic of grieving is so overlooked. And I know a lot of this audience is probably struggling with this process. So Claire, would you mind telling us, who you are, what you do, and what motivates you to put out the work that you do?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me and and for making space to talk about this because you're right, it's such an important and overlooked topic. Um, my name's Claire Bidwell Smith. I am a therapist. I specialize in grief. I worked in hospice for a number of years, and then I've been in private practice for about a decade. And I've written three books about grief and loss. And my most recent book is called Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief, where I put together the connection between those two. I come to all this work from a really personal place. Both of my parents got cancer at the same time when I was 14 years old. I'm an only child, and my mother died when I was a freshman in college, and then my father died just as I was finishing college. And so I entered into adulthood very alone and in the throes of grief and just in a really different place from a lot of my peers. And so I was just grappling with a lot. And one of the things I was really grappling with was anxiety. And for a long time, I just thought that there was something wrong with me. I didn't even connect it to my own grief, my own losses. I just thought there was something wrong with me. And it wasn't until I was in grad school and I was reading more about trauma and PTSD, and I was seeing these kind of some of these parallels popping up. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is all from going through these losses. It's from watching my parents die of cancer. It's from, just going through their deaths and being here and not also not having support around my grief, which I didn't have a lot of in my young life, my young adult life. And so I began to write about it and talk more about it as I became a therapist. And the more I wrote about it, just like little articles online, people just started flooding my office and they were like, oh my God, is this a thing? Because I am going through it. I'm having panic attacks. My dad just died, or, I'm feeling like anxious all the time after I've gone through this loss, or I've been anxious for 10 years since I lost so and so. And so I suddenly had this really great population of people to work with and kind of study it even more. And just really was able to see the kind of scope of how we become anxious after we go through a loss. And so that became the basis for my most recent book. And now I think about it and talk about it all the time. I mean, the good news is that there's so much we can do to heal from it and work on it, but it's become so obvious to me that it really is a component of grief. I think it's difficult to go through a significant loss and not come out of it with some amount of anxiety.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I kind of think back to where I was before I learned all this too. Like, oh my gosh, I also lost my dad really early, and then my mom was kind of intermittently
Mhm.
present. Like she was working two jobs trying to support us. So there was, of course, like, is she there? And then she's not there. And then she's there, and then she's not there. And of
Yeah.
course, there's this, having come across on the other side. But for those viewers who are kind of new to this, and maybe they are feeling anxious in their relationships, and a lot of this audience has like that anxious attachment style. How do you know like you are grieving? Like what are the stages? Because I feel like for a lot of people, maybe this word is kind of ambivalent and kind of vague. So how would somebody know if they are grieving?
You're right. I mean, grief can be kind of ambivalent. And I think in the last year during the pandemic, we've recognized more than ever that we can grieve for so many things. We can grieve the loss of a job. We can grieve our health. We can grieve culturally and publicly for something that's happening. We can grieve our kids being home from school. And then we can obviously grieve really significant losses like the death of someone we love. And grief is a very mercurial process. It comes and goes. We come in and out of many different emotions when we're grieving. There are many periods of feeling numb, of being in denial around grief. There's many ways that we push grief away. So I think often we can kind kind of fool ourselves into thinking we're past it or we don't have as much grief as we thought we would. And really, we're pushing it away and it's manifesting in other places like anger, like anxiety, like substance abuse, or toxic relationships. It can manifest in so many different ways when we don't allow ourselves like the real, simple, pure processing of grief. But that is so hard and scary for most of us, and rightly so. Grief is an enormous process. It's a huge amount of emotion. And there's so many different emotions and life changes that come with loss. And so I think most of us run from it, and we don't have a culture that really supports it. We're not great at grieving in America, in Western culture. We're not great at holding space for it. So we don't have a lot of messages that help us really sit with it. But I think we know we're grieving when we can tie some amount of our whatever emotions we're feeling to the loss of someone. And so whether you've had an uptick in anxiety following a loss, or you feel really stuck in anger and irritability following a loss, those are still signs of grieving. Maybe not the healthiest ways of grieving. We can get stuck very easily in some of these more unhealthy ways because we're afraid to enter into more of the sadness or work through feelings of regret and remorse, or, work through some of that anxiety and why we're feeling fearful. The other thing I'll say about grief too is that it lasts so much longer than most people give it credit for. The very first few months of going through a loss, you often feel very numb and there's a lot of stuff happening and people are coming around and you're busy. And then that dies off. And some of the deepest grief happens between the 3 to 12 month mark of a first loss, like a big loss. And so that's when a lot of loss is happening. And then, grief is happening. And then we can also still be grieving for years after that. I don't think we're always in acute grief, which is like really in the throes of processing and trying to understand this loss. But significant losses stay with us throughout our lifetime, and they get stirred up in all kinds of other ways. Like when I was going through a divorce in my 30s, a lot of my old grief around losing my family came up because I was kind of going through that again. So there's many times in our lives when old grief comes back in a new way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really want to touch on this because, like I said, a lot of people, here watching, probably are struggling with their anxiety. And yet for them, it probably feels like, I know as a hypnotist, a lot of clients are like, oh, it's this thing coming out of nowhere. It's this thing that's like attacking me. It's this other force that's like taking over my body. But what I'm hearing you say is that this is actually something that is manifested in childhood. And Claire, can you touch on a little bit more about how, that maybe a loss in childhood or some kind of trauma in childhood affects, like, how does it affect our relationships as adults? Like how might it show up for us?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that plays out for a lifetime. I work with a lot of clients who went through loss in childhood or adolescence, usually the loss of a parent, but sometimes another family member. And the thing about going through loss in childhood and adolescence is that often we can't fully developmentally grieve or understand it until we're in our 20s and 30s. And so the grief gets extended over this really long period of time, decades. I will have someone who, say, lost a mom at age 11. Inevitably, these people end up coming to me between the ages of like 28 and 35. There's something really interesting that happens in that age frame where I think we've become fully able to grieve, where we weren't able to at age 11 or 14 or 17. We just developmentally couldn't. We didn't have all the pieces there to understand the loss, to let ourselves feel it and move through it. But we often end up getting stuck in these earlier stages of it and these earlier developmental understandings of it. And going through a loss like that in childhood or adolescence, we don't have the coping tools that we have as adults. We don't have the scope to understand it as we do as adults. And so we do the best we can, but often with these kind of coping tools that don't work later on, right? And so we enter into adulthood with maladaptive coping skills or things that we, did the best we could with. And so there's a lot of work to be done when you become an adult and can look back and really kind of put the pieces together and look at how that loss affected you, and look at how it's playing out today. And then two other things about that. I mean, one is secondary traumas often happen when you go through a big loss in childhood. If it's a family member, there's often secondary traumas. If you lose your mother, often your father, either isn't there, isn't available, shows up in the wrong ways, gives you the wrong messages about grief. And this could go vice versa. It could be the mom who's doing this too. It's, or marries someone new that is really difficult. So there's like secondary traumas that come, or just being unsupported by not having a parent. You end up being more susceptible to other things that happen in life. And this is really shown in the ACEs, the ACE studies that came out in the 90s. If you want to look those up, there's a lot of really interesting information about the ACEs, and those are the markers that happen in early childhood adolescent trauma. The other thing that happens is our attachment. I'm sure you know about attachment theory and how we attach to people that we love and who support us in our lives. And so when we lose an attachment figure like a parent, it really changes how we enter into relationships for the rest of our lives. So often we skew one way or the other. We skew into anxiety-ridden attachment or anxious attachment, or we skew into avoidant attachment. So either we're very fretting and fearful and preoccupied about our relationships all the time, usually romantic partnerships, feeling very insecure about them, we're worried about them all the time, we're constantly thinking about them, or we're avoiding them and holding everybody at arm's length. Either we're unable to get into relationships, or we do get into them, but we can only go so deep. And so those are two of the ways that attachment will play out after a big loss in childhood or adolescence. And again, those are things that can be worked on. Once you start to recognize that this is something that's happening, that you went through this loss and now it's playing out in this way, there's amazing work to be done. But it does you need help with it. You can't do it on your own.
Yeah, like you said, especially if you don't have the tools, like if you weren't taught the tools in childhood. I know a huge like hindrance for me was, my mom, after my dad passed away when I was 11, my mom didn't allow herself to grieve. And
Yeah.
so for her, it was like, oh, I don't want to, maybe it was like, I don't want to be weak for my children, or I don't, maybe too afraid to be vulnerable. And because of that, I didn't know how to deal with it. I was like,
Right.
I don't think I even knew what grieving was,
Yeah.
or that it was a process that I had to go through at some
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, she was sending you the message. If she wasn't grieving, she wasn't modeling it for you. So then you weren't grieving and you didn't know how to do it. And it's probably something you came back to at different times in your life, And I've worked with a lot of women who've lost a spouse and been raising children, or vice versa, men who've lost a spouse and raising children. And often they've told me that they didn't feel able to grieve. I mean, they felt like they were in survival mode. They were taking care of these kids. If they were to let themselves grieve, they felt like they would have fallen apart. And so they push it off too, and it still comes back. I have so many people that would be like, 10 years ago I lost a spouse and now I'm ready to do some grief work around it.
Yeah. Yep. And I already know, like, there's people watching, and I know I work with like some moms who come in, and maybe this is resonating with some of you viewers. Do you feel like you have to be a certain way? You have to kind of push everything down so that you can be this role model? Well, I think the question becomes, what kind of role model do you want to be? Do you want to be that role model that models you're not allowed to be sad, or you're not allowed to cry? And then we end up making ourselves wrong, or dismissing and disregarding our emotions. And of course, then we start to look for someone to complement that in the future.
That's
So we
right.
end up with, narcissistic type people, and people who are
Exactly.
backing that, backing up our self-image, that we're like, not good enough. And I'm sure, some of your clients or patients, do you ever find that like they blame themselves for what happened when they're children?
Oh yeah, definitely. And again, that's one of those maladaptive coping methods that happens, or it's like a weird understanding that it's the only way they can understand it as an adolescent, and it comes in tandem with those messages of not grieving, and so and I've seen a lot of people blame themselves, and even adults do it too, and I think we hold ourselves very accountable. The loss is so immense, the pain is so immense that we feel like, oh my God, if I could just change this, if I could change this outcome. And when we start to think about that, that's when we start to go back and blame ourselves for things we could have done differently, or should have done, or said, or showed up in some way. But I've also found that guilt is such an interesting thing around grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who coined the 5 stages of grief, she had a great quote that I love that says, "Guilt is perhaps grief's most painful companion." And it's rare that I've seen someone grieving who hasn't felt some amount of guilt. And what I've discovered is that sometimes we hold on to guilt as a way of holding on to the person that we lost and the love that we have for them, because we feel as though, okay, well, if I don't feel guilty anymore that I didn't show up that night or didn't take that phone call, if I stop feeling guilty about that, then that means I stop caring. And that's not true, but it's a funny thing that our brain does, right? And so the work that I do with people is to help them find a different way to stay connected to their person, a different way to feel like they're honoring them and loving them, rather than holding on to this guilt that isn't serving anybody, you know?
Yeah. I mean, what message would you have for someone who maybe, maybe they're listening to this interview and they're like, okay, well, all of my life I've been told I need to be the strong person, I need to be that role model. And, maybe they're afraid to grieve. Maybe they're, I know for me, I was actually, when I was young, after my father passed away, I remember being sent to a grief camp. Like there was actually a camp for grieving. And,
Yeah.
I remember sitting there just frozen. And I was like, I'm not talking to any of these people about what I'm going through. And everybody else is sharing, there's these horrific stories. And I was just like, not happening. No way. Like,
Yeah.
do you ever like what's happening there where it's like maybe there's just like blocking it out?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's that fear. It's the fear that if you open up to it, it's going to be too big. You can't handle it. It's going to take over. You'll fall apart. This happens for kids, adolescents, parents, adults, it's that feeling because, again, it's so big. The grief is so immense. And we do anything to run from it. We shut down, we block it out, we disassociate, we drink, we get into, bad relationships, we overwork, we travel, we do anything to not feel it, right? But then it does spill out in these other ways that are unhealthy: anxiety, anger, depression. And so I think that for someone who's feeling that, just getting some support around it, like it's really hard to go through on our own. I don't think we should have to go through it by ourselves. And I don't think we should think that we have to. And so getting some support, because if you feel like you're going to fall apart if you open up this Pandora's box of grief, find somebody who can hold that space for you and help see you through it. I mean, that's what my work is I sit and I hold space and I let people open up all that grief, and I hold that, and I remind them that they're going to be okay, and we're going to walk through this together, and they're going to come out on the other side, being able to hold that grief in their lives and hold that loss in their lives. But it can be really scary.
Mhm. What about for those people who are struggling with grieving around someone who's no longer in their life? Like maybe they've passed away. Is there a way to grieve people who have maybe passed away?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we can always be grieving people that we have passed away or abandoned us or not showed up, or relationships that ended, breakups. I mean, there's so many different things, and it can be years, and you can go back into and tap into that grief. And that takes work again.
Yeah, Claire. So can you talk to the audience a little about, what if somebody listening here is saying, okay, well, how do I grieve someone who's no longer in my life? Like maybe they've passed away. Can we grieve someone who's no longer in our life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can grieve for a lot of different, grieve for someone who's died. We can grieve for someone who's abandoned us or didn't show up for us. We can grieve the end of relationships and breakups. I mean, there's a million different ways to grieve. And again, I think it's like, it's being conscious about it. It's being intentional, walking into a support group or a therapist's office or a hypnotist's office and really sitting down and being like, I need to do some work around this, and I need to open up these memories, and I need to open up this pain. And it can be years ago. And it's still there to work through. And I also think that it's important to find ways to stay connected to the people that we loved. Not everybody had a great relationship with someone they lost. So a lot of people have complicated relationships with people they lost. So in that case, it's different. But when you have someone that you were really close with and that you loved, finding ways to stay connected to them is really important. An internal relationship, a spiritual relationship. In the grief clinical world for a long time, there was this belief that when somebody died, we should just move on and let go. And now we've come to realize that this idea of continuing bonds, that we need to keep our relationship going, that feels much more congruent with our soul and our psyche, to keep our relationship going in some form. And that looks like, for me, that looks like I still write letters to my mother. She's been gone for 25 years, and I still write letters to her, and I tell her about myself, and I tell her about my life. I'm always wearing something of hers. Like I have earrings on right now that were hers. I talk about her to my children all the time. Just kind of keeping her presence in my life, is really important, and it's better than not doing it.
Yeah. And I love how you use that word intentional,
Hmm.
because I think, kind of the default that people go to is like, oh, I'll get over it, or
Hmm.
they kind of let it happen the grieving happen at its own pace, which is also fine.
Yeah.
But, I found as a hypnotist, I was talking to people and I was like, I was actually able to process like losses really, kind of on an expedited, um, on a quicker at a quicker pace. Not that it took like a few seconds or minutes, like it still took, I can just think of past relationships where they would have sat with me for years and I would have been in agony for years.
Yeah.
And I can start to feel okay about it, maybe somewhere within like 6, 8 months or like a year. And I
Hmm.
remember a friend asking me, well, how did you do that? And what my answer to her was like, it was just like you said, like I was intentional about it. Like I went to all of those places that made me upset. I went and looked at those pictures. I got angry. I wrote those letters. Like I leaned into it.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about being intentional, I love that you brought that up, because now it's like there's this, I want to feel different. You're making you're taking an active effort.
Yeah, it's being conscious about it and like just facing it, making time and space for it. I'll tell people like you can schedule time for your grief if you feel like you need to do that. Like pick a Saturday afternoon when you know you don't have anything going on that night, you don't have to work the next day, and take the afternoon and like light some candles, look through some old photos, listen to old voicemails, watch old videos, write a letter to your person and like let it rip open, for the afternoon, and that's an amazing thing we can do for ourselves and our loved ones in our grief.
Mhm. And I love that. I love how you talk about scheduling a time, because I
Mhm.
know probably a lot of people watching, including myself in the past, I was like, like I don't have time. Like if I feel something coming up when I'm
Yeah.
driving, I'm about to go into a meeting, like, I don't have time. And for those of you listening, like, are you hearing these strategies Claire is giving you? Like this is priceless. Like, you can, what she's saying, right, is you can kind of, I know what I do in the moment is like if I feel like something bubbling up and I'm about to go into a
Mhm.
meeting or with a client, I say, okay, there it is. There's something
Mhm.
there that needs to be addressed,
Yeah,
and sort of like putting it on the bookshelf for a little bit later, and then intentionally going back and picking up
exactly.
that book.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, what can you tell us, like, as we wrap up here, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but as we wrap up here, like, why would you say, like, why is it important to do this process? Because, everybody here can continue to go through life and stuff down their emotions, but can you talk a little bit about like what are the consequences of going through life and continuing to dismiss and disregard yourself versus like, processing the stuff, letting it out and processing those emotions.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think we know the consequences. I think that when we are not facing our life, our pain, our past, our traumas, when we're not trying to do some work around those things, then we see ourselves with anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, bad relationships. We see ourselves repeating patterns over and over, like, when you're like, oh my God, I've done this relationship already. I've already done this one. Why am I in this shitty friendship again? Or whatever it is, it's like all these things happen and we realize that we just keep repeating patterns. And that's because we're not doing the work. We're not taking the time to really acknowledge what it is that's happening inside of us that's bringing all of these things out and playing out. And so I think I think choosing to be conscious, to be intentional, to notice what's happening in ourselves and notice what's coming up, and then deciding to do some work around it. But again, I don't think we need to do that on our own. I don't think we should be alone as we do it. I don't think we need to muscle through something. Get some help, sit down with somebody, a support group, a counselor, a pastor, a hypnotist, anybody and anything to sit and be like, hey, I've got some stuff I need to work through. Can you support me and help me figure it out? And I think that the results always are beneficial. We have better relationships with the people that we love, our families, our children, ourselves. We are healthier physically. And then we also feel like we have more exciting things that happen in our life. It opens up a million opportunities. So I think it's always worth doing the work, even though it can be really hard and scary.
Yeah. Yeah. So Claire, you listed off like a bunch of things like, and I know as a hypnotist, like how this manifests, later on, if you find yourself maybe, you're struggling with like emotional eating or trouble sleeping,
Mhm.
or, like you said, repeating like relationship patterns you keep attracting and you keep staying in relationships that like are hurtful or
Mhm.
don't feel good. If you keep, maybe it's just something as simple as like smoking or
Mhm.
struggling with feeling good about yourself, your self-esteem, all of these things are connected
Yeah,
to some sort of grief, right? And
exactly.
like you said, like don't do this alone. It's hard to do this alone if you haven't had the proper role models. So um,
Yeah.
reach out for help if you're listening and this is resonating with you. And I know, Claire, you have a lot of free resources on your website. I know you have a free gift for this audience. Like, go
Mhm.
get this gift, guys. Like, I'm telling you, I'm never going to get this group together again. And Claire is such a wealth of information around this topic. So, Claire, can you talk to us about this meditation course that you have for this
Yeah,
audience?
it's a three-part meditation course. It can be done on your own time, anytime. You can come back to it. It's just three, very simple meditations to help you open up to your grief a little bit, help you sit with it, connect with your person, work through different big feelings that are coming up. And again, it's something you can do on your own time and over a period of time. So it's there and available for all of you.
Mhm. And I think this is the perfect time, as we're all kind of like sitting at home and we're kind of for lack of a better word, kind of stuck with our emotions, right? They're
Yeah.
gonna be there. And with the pandemic, I think a lot of people are asking the question of how can I start to feel better? How can I start to change my life? So click the link below, guys. Go get this free resource. Like this is gold here. Like this is stuff that's going to help you get started. If you're a little hesitant, you're afraid to reach out, like this is a great way to get you on the right path to overcoming and being able to process any patterns you keep repeating. If you want to improve your relationships, you want to feel better about yourself, you want to improve your health, like this work has to happen. And you get to do this, right? This is an opportunity for you to be able to transform your life and the way you feel. And Claire, thank you so much for your time here. I know
Yeah.
this is going to resonate with our viewers.
I'm so glad. Thank you again for creating space for this, for all this healing for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. So click the link below. Go get it today. This offer is only going to be around for the next 48 hours after this interview. Go get it today. Click the link below. And Claire, thank you so much for your time. And go check out her website. And what's your website again, Claire?
Just clairebidwellsmith.com.
Awesome. Go get it. Go check it out. Don't wait. Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, thank you.